Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, everyone, depending on where you are in the world today. And it's a real welcome and thank you for joining us on this event, this webinar. My name's Justin Srivastava. I'm going to be your compere today, and it's my pleasure to welcome you on behalf of GLEFA. For those of you who don't know what GLEFA is or have an involvement with GLEFA, it's the Global Law Enforcement and Public Health Association, and we'll talk more about them in a second or two. And wherever we mention anything, you'll see us try and put something up on the screen so you can see what GLEFA is. I'm on the board for GLEFA, but I'm also the co-chair of the Trauma Informed Special Interest Group. And it's today that we're going to be talking about trauma informed practice and particularly trauma informed policing. And one of our key roles in our special interest group is to try and showcase work that's happening around the globe. And in this case from Canada, but we also have representatives from all over the world talking about trauma-informed practice, and wherever we can, we put webinars on to support those. GLEFA is a not-for-profit organisation. It has all sorts of different kinds of members: academics, practitioners, system leaders, members of the community, and so on. But they've all got one key goal, and that's all about the intersectionality between law enforcement and public health. Why? Because we recognise that a lot of the drivers of crime, a lot of the drivers of police demand, law enforcement demand, are actually the same drivers that also drive everyone else's agendas, whether it's health agendas around heart disease, lung disease, obesity, whether it's social work agendas or whatever. All of those same drivers drive us all. So therefore, there's a real need to address them together in a partnership way, bringing all of those different sectors together. We try and do that through GLEFA, and as you can see there on the website, you're more than welcome to join GLEFA. And when you do join, you're able to also join the special interest groups, of which there are many. And we're always glad to have new members joining with all the expertise that's out there. But also every year we have an international conference, and you can see on the screen behind me, it's the known as the Law Enforcement and Public Health Conference, LEPH, and it began in 2012. The first one was in Melbourne, and we've had many over the years in different places. Last year we were in Canada, in Ottawa, and this year we're in Leeds in the United Kingdom. So it's the first time for a long time that we've had it back in the United Kingdom, and that's going to be happening, as you can see on the screen there, from the 6th to the 9th of September. And a lot of the stuff that we're going to be talking about today, you'll see talked about in a lot of detail over the 3, 4, 5 days at that conference. And I've been to many conferences, certainly over my time in policing, and it's definitely the best international conference that I've ever been to because it brings people like yourselves together talking about common things that impact upon us all. However, we're not here to talk about that in a lot of detail. We're here to welcome our speakers, Val and Maddie, and I'm really delighted to welcome both of you from Barrie Police Service in Ontario, Canada. Val and Maddie will introduce themselves in a lot more detail, but Val has 29 years of policing experience, served in a wide range of leadership roles from frontline policing, major crime, crime against persons, sexual violence, intimate partner violence, victim services, tactical operations, and operational change. And Val is also, and we'll talk a lot about this today, the co-author of the Canadian Framework for Trauma-Informed Response in Policing. And she's contributed extensively to national work around that and intimate partner violence. Joining Val is Madison Charman, an organisational researcher with Barrie Police and a PhD candidate in criminology and social justice at Ontario Tech University. And as Val said to me earlier on, Maddie is the engine room. Maddie is the engine room for all of this work. So we'll hear a lot from Maddie. And she's going to combine her operational policing experience with her academic research experience and talk a lot around youth prevention, police legitimacy, partner violence, trauma-informed policing, and the integration of AI and technology if we wanted to go down that path. So I think we've got some really useful and helpful discussions to be had today with a real combination of practical experience, research experience, and innovation. So What I would like you to do, if you can, turn your cameras on. It's always great to see you, and we can see what's happening. But it's okay if you can't. If you've got questions as we go through, please put them in the chat bar. We'll answer as many of them as we can at the end. Val and Maddie will talk for about an hour, and then we should have half an hour for questions. So I'm looking for some really rich questions from all of you as we go through. So without further ado from me, thank you for joining us. And I want to hand over to Val and Maddie. Please join me in welcoming them to this webinar.
You're good to go. Wonderful. Thank you. And thank you for that introduction. Before we get started, I just want everyone to know that you will see a QR code on the screen throughout the entire presentation. If you scan that QR code, that is going to take you to the document that we will be referring to today. So we did get a quick introduction there, a little bit again on me, 29 years in policing. This work that you're going to hear about today really comes out of I'm the co-chair of the Victims of Crime Committee for the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. And so I've done a lot of work in the trauma area. It is a passion of mine. I think it's worth mentioning also that Madison is the other co-author of this particular framework. And Maddie, do you want to do a quick intro?
Yes. Hi, everybody. So I work as a researcher in the Barrie Police Service, which is kind of a unique position in policing. So I am an embedded researcher. So I get to, wear the uniform, work with the officers, see the operational day-to-day, but also marry in kind of that academic lens, that evaluation lens, the data lens, and so get to partner on a lot of really cool projects like this and bring in the research side and into the policing world. So that's what I get to do.
Great. So today we're going to take you through the framework. At the completion of that, Madison's going to tell you show you a few initiatives that the Barrie Police has implemented in looking at some of our systems when we apply that trauma-informed lens. So before we start, I just want to acknowledge the work of the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police Victims of Crime Committee. When we started, we wanted to make sure that we had a very robust representation of policing across Canada. In Canada, we have provincial, regional, federal, and Indigenous policing partners. And so we really wanted to create this framework that could be adaptable to all of our policing partners across Canada and essentially across the globe. So these are the individuals that joined us to help create this framework. You can see that it's a very diverse representation. So I just wanted to acknowledge their work as well. It is, this framework is built on a decade of national work here in Canada that has been guided by the Canadian Association of Chiefs of Police. So the National Framework for Collaborative Police Action on Intimate Partner Violence, that was launched in 2016. And then in 2019, we did launch the Canadian Framework for Collaborative Police Response on Sexual Violence. And it was through the work of that framework in particular that we started hearing a lot of feedback in regards to, from our partners that were looking at our sexual assault occurrences within Barrie Police. We started to hear a lot about, what is this trauma-informed approach that we're hearing that we need to apply? And so that's when we decided we really wanted to look into this and build a framework that really could work from, and what we like to say, from contact to conclusion. So from the time a police dispatcher answers the phone to the conclusion of the case. However, you will find it's very much built around that frontline response, recognizing that first contact that our officers have with that victim on the road really sets the pace for the rest of the incident. So why this work matters, I know I probably don't have to tell this group. You've all been working in these systems for a long time. We know that policing is full of good people who genuinely want to help, but those good people are still working within systems. And those systems include things like our policies, our procedures, our training, our culture, some long-standing historical practices, and that is really what is shaping the outcomes that we produce. And so it is not about suggesting that we are doing a bad job or that we've been doing a bad job. It really is about recognizing that those good people that are working in those systems that really were built before we had a good understanding of what trauma is. So that's why trauma-informed policing cannot only be based on good intentions. Our intentions may be good, but we have to examine the impact of our response and ask whether those systems are helping people or unintentionally adding harm. So I like to, and normally we're presenting to sort of police groups. We know that trauma-informed policing still can be misunderstood. And so usually when I get to this point, I just want to make it clear by what we mean when we say trauma-informed policing. And you'll see Madison is with me here today, and that's because she is a researcher, and trauma-informed policing really is evidence-based. It is safety-focused. It's still accountability-driven. It helps us understand how trauma may affect a person's behavior, how they communicate, how they recall, so that we as police officers can respond more effectively and make better informed decisions. I have heard that trauma-informed policing is soft policing. It is not soft policing. We are not lowering our investigative standards. In fact, we are increasing them. We are not excusing criminal behavior. We're not removing accountability. We are strengthening our systems and our response. And so that really increases accountability because the value and the quality of what we're putting before the courts actually has increased. So touching quickly on the framework principles, it is grounded in several core principles, including safety, choice, cultural humility, accountability, and continuous improvement. This is known as procedural justice. So procedural justice really anchors this work because trauma-informed policing isn't just about the outcome. It's about how people experience the process. So whether they feel heard, respected, whether they feel like they've been treated fairly. So that really was the starting point for all of this work.
And I will say we're looking very Canadian right now because we both have a Tim Hortons coffee cup. So I would just like to give a shout out to that. So yes, when we look at the framework principles and look at procedural justice, it's not just about what police do, but how they do it, right? So we look at, the outcome may be arrest, and we'll talk about kind of a cool project we did in our cells actually. So the outcome may be an arrest for an offender, for example. But how police go about that is really important. Same with victim. It may not be, a favorable court outcome, but how they experience that process is so important, right? And even when we look at police, right? So there's a lot of research on, it's usually called organizational justice, but how police internally experience, right? So their leadership, their organization, do they feel as though they've been heard? So it's really looking at, voice, neutrality, respect, and trustworthiness across the spectrum here. And I know, especially when we speak to police audiences, the offender piece is a bit of a frame shift, right? So we think a lot when we do trauma-informed policing and even like the past frameworks really is victim focused, which is extremely important. But we also have to think of the other side of police clients and the other side of police clientele and who we're dealing with a lot. And that is often offenders. And offenders themselves, research shows, have often significant trauma. And so that's really important in guiding our practices too. And it's, again, not about negating accountability, but it's about how we do things. They may still end up arrested, et cetera, and held accountable for their actions, but how we're doing that can change and better serve even victims when you're looking at supporting, for example, offenders and getting them the help they need. So I think it's an important mind shift. And we'll talk a lot about offenders and research on like victim offender overlap and stuff, but just remembering that procedural justice, and when we talk about trauma-informed policing, it touches kind of all of these individuals that interact with the justice system.
Perfect. So here is your first look at what we are calling the 6R model. So our Canadian framework is a 6R model. It has been adapted from the SAMHSA 4R model. So the SAMHSA, the Substance Abuse and Mental Health Services Administrative Model, it is a very well-respected model, very much known in the social services sort of work. But we knew that our model had to be a little bit more operational, that reflect both that frontline realities and that organizational culture. So we expanded that structure to what we call the 6R model. It is unique. It's both practical and cultural, and it guides individual officers' responses, shaping sort of that organizational accountability. So what we have coined our 6R model, and these are the 6Rs that we're going to go through a very high overview of what we mean in each section. But the section, realize, recognize, rethink, respond, reduce, and review. So we're going to take you through that, and then Madison's going to show you how you can apply this lens to most things that you do within policing and how you can look at your organization and your systems. So the first is realize, the first pillar. We placed it here, very intentionally, because we are starting by asking police services to understand sort of that widespread and long-term impact of trauma. It reminds us that responsibility lies both with the individual officer, but also with the entire organization. We know that trauma isn't rare. We know that most of the people we serve and many within our own organizations, they're carrying trauma. And so how police respond to that reality can either support that recovery and healing, or it can compound the harm. So that really is the foundation that everything else needs to be built on. we know what happens when trauma goes unrecognized. So behavior can easily be misunderstood. We might interpret survival responses as resistance. The misinterpretation does not come again from that bad intent. It comes from those systems and those practices that were not always designed with trauma in mind. We may escalate things when we don't need to. We may miss risk when it's actually present. When understanding decision-making breakdown, when misunderstanding that decision-making, if we don't have all that information, that's where that legitimacy, it really starts to erode. So people start to disengage. They stop calling for help, and Madison will speak to a Barrie Police research project where this exactly was the case. They stop trusting the process or the outcome, even when the system believes it acted accordingly. And so that's why realize really, really matters. So trauma-informed policing does not begin with trying to identify or diagnose trauma in the person in front of us. It begins with understanding that widespread impact and recognizing where our systems can be contributing to the harm. So once we get through, realizing that it is an issue within our organizations and within our communities, that's where this is where it gets a little bit more practical. So this is when we ask, we're looking at an individual and we start to ask ourselves, is this behavior or is this survival? So it applies to victims, witnesses, accused persons, even professionals working inside our own systems. So if realize is about acknowledging there's a widespread problem, recognizes where we start to understand, what we are actually seeing in front of us. And I know this group is probably very familiar and has heard about this, but I won't go too far into the science here because I am a police officer, I'm not a doctor. But I do remember the connection to this work when I first started looking at the brain and trying to understand the brain on trauma. And so in very simple terms, the amygdala hijack takes over the brain's alarm system, it's running the show. The prefrontal cortex, which helps with reasoning and decision-making and organizing information, it goes on a bit of a coffee break. And then the hippocampus, which helps organize memories and places and events into context and sequence, it's just not doing its job very well. So when I understood that put so much in context for me. So of course, someone may not give us a neat or chronological account. They remember pieces of an incident, but struggle with others. So it doesn't automatically mean they're lying. And I think historically that, was a belief or a training point that we were given as police officers, but they're not lying. They're not being uncooperative. Their brain may have been focused on survival at that point in time, not on preparing a clear statement for the police afterwards. So Madison's going to take us through a little bit more here. I'll send that over to you.
Yeah. So when Val and I were talking the other day about how our passions kind of come out. So I right now am doing some projects on youth and youth who are involved in police and looking at touch points and kind of figuring out how to speak with officers on what they're seeing, because a lot of the times right now we may see a youth that, and I can think of plenty in my head as I was just in the data set that, are showing up and they're like the nuisance. Oh, it's that bad kid, we're getting calls. But then when we go into their background, we see, the history of sexual violence when that young girl was 9, et cetera. So understanding kind of the pathway, because they may just see that nuisance kid, but trying to explain the behavior and how that kid got there, I think is really important for trauma-informed policing and understanding that why and the brain science. So we try and do a lot of education on that. The Alberta Family Wellness Brain Story is a great resource. It's free and takes you very in depth on kind of the brain science behind trauma. And they just developed a specific, I think it's a 2-hour course for law enforcement. So I think it's really important. So of course, in Canada, we get lots of snow, and we kind of think of, to get to your destination, you got 2 roads you get to pick. One is the plowed road that through, my experience as a youth, that's the flex that I do. That's the path I know. That's what I know. And when it's kids who've experienced trauma, sometimes it's not the calm decision making and the social emotional regulation. Sometimes it's that punch or that yell or that screaming in public for attention or whatever that looks like, right? So we have these pathways that we plow. It's so much easier to go down the ones we know, right? The more you drive over it, the clearer it gets. That's just your pathway. And so that continues, right? As adults, you just continuously take that pathway. And so you kind of flex a muscle that may not be the best route. Whereas things like calm decision-making, calming down, kind of self-regulating is not a muscle you get to flex very much. So it's not the road you're going to take. And it's really important when we look at adult outcomes, right? So there was research by Moffitt in 2011 that looks specifically at executive function. So, I mean, I'm sure everybody here kind of knows that I don't need to go into the depth of it, but kind of that calm decision making that like most adults are expected to have, that executive function. When you're low on executive function, there's actually a shown increase in your risk of criminal conviction. And for policing, we know criminal conviction is pretty far ahead, right? So the lower executive function you have, you're even higher risk for just overrepresentation in police interactions, right? Whether it be through drug use, whether it be through social disorder, homelessness, etc., right? So it's not always criminality. A lot of the times it's kind of these antisocial behaviors that have been criminalized, or we see a social disorder that again just interacts with the police and the justice system. So it's really important to understand, even when we talk about youth or kind of justice clients or victims that we deal with or offenders, and we'll talk a little bit about how those aren't necessarily separate groups all the time. What you're dealing with may not seem to make sense as somebody who has high executive function and can sit here and say, I would have never made that decision. But those people are using the plowed roads that they know, right? They're stuck in that. And it's so important to see that. And when you look at, the impact of adversity on the life course, and kind of, I always think about it really as like it becomes a cycle, right? So early trauma and stress impacts you. You're having, not great, if you go to school at all, school performance. And then you look at attention problems, social isolation, poor understanding of social cues, right? And then that puts you at higher risk of things like alcohol, tobacco, drug use, right? And as police, we're thinking, oh, this kind of sounds like a population we deal with quite often, right? And I think of those kids that now become the nuisance kids are kind of stuck in this cycle. Then you look at, poor educational attainment, etc. Now you have very low confidence in your abilities. You don't feel like you belong anywhere. And then, that really impacts how you go into adulthood. You look at lower paying jobs or unemployment, public assistance, involvement in the criminal justice system. We talked, at Justin, you said at the start, right? When it comes to health problems, right? The impact of toxic stress on your body, mental health, substance use. So it's very much a cycle because then, and I've heard this from a lot of officers that I've worked with, they've dealt with the parents and now they're dealing with the kids, and we're seeing kind of these cycles continue. So it's really important, again, not just what we do because their outcome may be their outcome, but how we do it, even looking at certain interactions as kind of like turning points in the best case scenario, and understanding how we can better support these individuals as they kind of go through these large systems. And a really big piece of this is looking at the victim offender overlap. So a lot of the things that lend someone towards victimization also lends them towards offending. And it's not saying that everybody who's been victimized will become an offender by any means, or every offender has been a victim. But I think in policing, we think of those as such a binary, right? There's the victims on one side, the offenders on the other side. They're two completely different clients and groups, but that is really not the case. And when we looked at our research here in Barrie, and of course this is limited because this is looking at our small jurisdiction only, we found that our highest harm offenders, 20% of them had been victims throughout their lifetime. And that's just police reported victimization, right? And in our area. So it very much is prevalent. And in policing, I'm sure you would see individuals who are also kind of caught up in cycles that then they end up increasing risk for victimization and offending behavior. So I think we need to stop thinking of it as this or that. It's, for a lot of people, this and that. And even when we look at Canadian research on our prison populations, talking about, 80% of men and 86% of women experience at least one ACE, right? So we're dealing with a population that has been exposed to a significant amount of trauma. And again, it's the outcome is the outcome. Yes, they're incarcerated, but how are we doing things to better serve or adjust or support individuals is where we really need that shift.
So just to sum up this section, it's really important in this section, and what we really want to concentrate on is, looking at those survival responses. So you're seeing, the fight, flight, freeze, or fawn, and fawn is a newer phase. You see fawn a lot in sexual assault cases, where we used to ask, did you say no? But this person is in a fawn state of survival. Sometimes we see that as police officers as sort of that anger or withdrawal, disassociation. None of those responses are chosen. And I think that's important for police officers to understand. The behavior that we misinterpret, so those inconsistent statements, those delays, disclosures, emotional reactions. This one is difficult because I've heard officers say, well, she was laughing when she was telling me about the sexual assault. That is a totally normal reaction to an abnormal situation. And so they really need to understand those trauma indicators. And then that harm that we don't see. In Canada, we're about to pass a coercive control law. I know across the country, different countries already have that coercive control law. So that is a part that we really want to focus on. That's not something we necessarily see. That's psychological injury, chronic fear, loss of autonomy. So that's looking at it through that trauma-informed lens. And so when we're only really looking at that physical harm, we're really missing the real risk. So the next section is one of my favorites. A lot of police services are getting a little bit stuck in this rethink section. I think most services along the continuum of the 6R model, they recognize, they realize, they know that this is out there, but they might be getting stuck up on thinking, how do we change our processes? Because it really is recognizing and understanding what trauma can look like. Then rethink is about asking what needs to change within our own systems because of that understanding. So this is where we have to challenge those assumptions, those long-standing historical practices. We have to adapt our practice. We have to look honestly at whether our policies, our training, our decision-making actually reflect that trauma-informed values. Because like we said at the beginning, even those well-intended systems can still cause harm if they are built on old assumptions. So that's really what Rethink asks us to do, not just to see trauma differently, but to respond to it differently in your culture, in your policy, and in your practice. So a good example is, and like I said, we're getting kind of stuck here because we're kind of steeped in tradition, and many of our practices have been in place for years for very good reasons. So when we ask leaders to sort of rethink those practices, it can feel as though we're saying that we're doing everything wrong. And like I said before, that is not what it means at all. We're working in systems that were built before we had a great understanding. We are simply asking them to look at those existing practices through that trauma-informed lens. Is it still working the way we intended? Could it be creating barriers or causing harm that we did not recognize? And is there an opportunity to do it better? So a good example, and this is in an IPV, an intimate partner violence situation. Oftentimes I will hear the comments of, why don't they just leave? The better way to ask that is, what barriers are they facing? Victims of intimate partner violence, there's financial barriers. There are housing barriers. There are, sometimes they just don't want to leave the family pet. There are so many things that can contribute to that. And when we look at that question through a trauma-informed lens, it's not why aren't they leaving? What are the barriers that are keeping them there? Another part of it, this is one that Madison's going to speak to as well. So in Canada, we have something called mandatory charge. So that means any incident of intimate partner violence where we believe there was an offense that occurred, we must, as police officers, lay a charge. That approach was introduced for many important reasons, was to increase that safety and reduce the pressure on the victims to reporting, and to make clear that intimate partner violence is a serious criminal offense. However, when we look at that now and we flip it and we look at it from a trauma-informed lens, and I'm very passionate in this area, so it took me a while to get to this spot, is that approach still working today, or is it causing more harm? So that is about challenging those defaulted narratives and really examining policy. So this is from a dual charge case. So what happened in this particular case? Both the man and the woman were charged with intimate partner violence because there was violence. There's something called dominant aggressor here in Canada, where you should take the time and try to figure out who was the dominant aggressor. However, they both got charged. And so the survivor said, calling the police was the scariest thing I've ever done. I never expected to be the one arrested. After that, I knew the system wasn't built for someone like me. So that is on us to examine and ask if it is still working for our communities.
Mhm. And not to like skip ahead, but I also want to, as the researcher, plug kind of the end of this cycle of like rethink, right? Like, are these things still working for us in the context that we have? And this could be a whole webinar in and of itself. But we started doing this research project looking at mandatory charging practices across Ontario, ideally across Canada, but starting in Ontario. And what we're asking is really what's working, what's not, and what could be adjusted to better help people. Because right now it's you shall charge. There's no time or place for victim voice or choice, which is really in a stark contrast when we look at sexual assault victims. And so we're kind of asking police to take two very different approaches depending on the situation somebody's in. And so when it comes to mandatory charge, even if a charge isn't in the best interest of the victim or the family, not what they want, it's kind of a too bad we're charging, you don't have a say in this. And that's a double-edged sword, right? A lot of individuals we've interviewed, so we've talked to police, probation, parole, advocates, victim serving agencies, etc. And we will be talking to victims and offenders in the future, is really talking about kind of this double-edged sword, right? We realize that this approach was put in place for a reason and it works for some, but there's other individuals who end up experiencing more harm or hardship because of this approach. And it's really important as well when we start looking at things like the paternalistic approach, because right now, the way we take this is, I am the system, I know better than you, and I am going to kind of overrule your wants and wishes. And again, when we talk to police, victim serving agencies, there are cases where that needs to happen, but that's not every single time. So having such a blanket policy for such a black and white, for such a gray issue and having such a black and white answer, it is really tough. So we're kind of looking at seeing what is a better way to make this more trauma informed, right? Because when we look at everybody involved, so for victims, for the most part, there's really no voice or choice. A lot of individuals will call police and ask for help, or, hey, I just really want them out, or, hey, I just want to document this so you know, and then unaware of the policy, and it feels like oh, gotcha. Well, now we have to go charge, and that's not what they wanted. And then disenfranchisement, right? So when it comes to charges, well, let's say there's no contact condition. Well, how is they will say traditionally in a sense, now paying the mortgage? If he e-transfers her, that's a breach, right? So it just gets very entangled, and there's a lot of kind of the law of unintended consequences that come with this. Same with accused right now in Canada. The approach is kind of an arrest should fix your behavior. I think when we talk about trauma and when we look at something like the death review committee with the coroner here in Ontario, one of the biggest factors of domestic homicide is an offender themselves having experienced ACEs and adversity, as well as severe mental health, depression, and substance issues. So it's really hard for us to say an arrest will fix all the problems, stop being a perpetrator of violence. Also, this approach really says, hey, victim, you figure out and get yourself safe, but there's no corrective action or kind of rehabilitation or supports for offenders to change behavior and stop causing harm. So that's kind of a weird spot where we're in as well. And then officers, a lot of them talk about, I know this charge is going to make things so much worse for this family, but my hands are tied, so I shall charge. And they leave that situation also feeling worse. So it's just understanding, not taking away a policy or this approach, but how can we just make it work better for individuals who are in these situations? And then, a big part of this too is when we look to realign policy and practice is asking, okay, so what instead? Or what does an adjustment look like, or a tweak, right? And so we talk a lot about, potential ideas, and these all come from individuals we've chatted with. So whether it be a frontline officer, a frontline shelter worker, et cetera, right? Hearing from the doers of the policy and those who are on the front lines experiencing this stuff, what could they see as alternatives? So this is kind of just an example of, right, when we have to rethink how we respond and what that looks like is kind of what started this research.
Thank you. And you can see how much we rely on Madison. We're constantly bringing ideas to her and asking her to help us back that up with the research. So the next section of the framework is the respond. So this is the most robust section of the framework. Obviously, this is where it has to start showing up in practice. And we're asking police leaders to embed this approach into all of their daily operations from the tone of that first contact all the way through the investigation. So this is where officers really start to kind of pay attention. And it's not just about policy. It really is about our interactions, how they play out in real time. We know that that first tone matters. Like I mentioned, that first officer on scene. And I'll even go so far as saying the dispatcher that answers the phone, that tone matters. It has to be calm. It has to be respectful. It has to be non-threatening communication. That will go a long way, long beyond that first interaction. The way we show up, and this is what we want officers to understand, your body language matters. Your voice matters. Even how we're standing in a doorway changes how people respond to us. And so this section really is trying to get officers to start thinking about that. We really want officers to understand that they need to offer choices where they can. So it might mean having a support person in an interview, present for a statement. It might be giving flexibility around when those statements are taken. Those small things can make a huge difference. And then that third one is minimizing the duplication. So survivors shouldn't have to tell their story over and over to many different systems. And so that is taking a really good look at how you're doing that as an organization and where sort of those statements are taking place. So as I mentioned, this is a really big section of the framework. We cannot go into all of it. A lot of these things are courses in and of themselves. So trauma-informed interviewing is a very, very important piece. I know across, I would say globally, some of the well-known interviewing techniques are the FEDI, the PEACE model. So this is really just touching the surface. We really just want, this is more for frontline officers. We know that they're probably not getting those really in-depth interviewing courses earlier on in their career. And so the idea here really is to just give them some simple takeaways that are going to make a huge difference. So it really is encouraging police services to understand that we really need to enhance that skill set in our frontline officers by embedding this trauma-informed awareness into the way interviews are structured, or even that first contact is structured. We want to create those better conditions for those officers. We know it starts with rapport. We know how we show up matters. We cannot have someone feeling judged, rushed, shamed, unsafe. You'll see we're going to give some suggestions on how to ask questions. There is information that we need as investigators, but there is a better way to ask them that doesn't feel as shaming. And historically, we have never really offered the choice of having a support person available in an interview, but we really want to encourage police services to encourage this. There's nothing wrong with having a support person. That is absolutely a trauma-informed approach. And so we do mention that in this framework as well. So mentioned that we want to help frontline officers, all officers really, to understand a better way to ask certain questions from that trauma-informed lens. So this is sort of a question that we hear a lot, especially in sexual violence. Did you say no? That's a clear question. We might want to know what was going on there, but it does assume that survival looks verbal or clear or immediate. But that trauma-informed approach recognizes that people respond, like we said, to threat in different ways, including that freezing or complying or disassociation. So instead of asking whether someone verbally resisted, we ask about sort of experience, reaction, and impact. So what are you able to recall doing, saying during that incident? How did the suspect react to your words or actions? Do you remember how that made you feel? So we encourage using senses, right? That language really that we choose here doesn't just affect the interview, it shapes how the whole thing is later understood. This QR code on here will take you to this document. We've created that for officers to either print or go right to and have it up on their phone if they're trying to figure out a better way to ask some questions. We have a few examples for you here. Another one that we hear a lot, why didn't you report it right away? To us, that might seem like a reasonable question, but to a survivor, it really feels like doubt. And if the delay means, they feel like that delay means that their experience is less credible. So that trauma-informed approach sort of gives alternatives. Did anything in particular cause you to come to us? Tell us about this incident today. Was there someone you trusted to tell about the incident after it occurred? When you told them, what were you thinking or feeling? What were you feeling physically and or emotionally after the incident? Oftentimes, this will bring up a little bit of a history when we ask it in this way. We don't know, maybe the victim has been in the hospital for 3 or 4 months, right? So that's a completely acceptable reason. We also know that the way that trauma happens, they're trying to get everything together so that they can come to the police with that statement. I oftentimes encourage survivors to not even come to us right away if they're not feeling safe, to go and speak to a counselor, speak to a trusted person, and come when they are ready. And I think we have to understand as police agencies that that's an acceptable practice. This is another piece that I feel that has really kind of not been a priority for policing for many, many years. We are really encouraging police services to take a look at trauma-informed report writing. So what we write, how we write it, that becomes the version of events that moves through the systems. So we know that they're read by supervisors, by judges, by defense counsel, by child protection. So this really shapes interpretation. So we really need to start with neutral language. We need to describe the behavior without judgment or influence. We have to avoid, assumptions. We have to document survivor input, exactly how they're saying it, exactly how they remember it, and accuracy and consistency. Because we know this is following people through systems. This oftentimes shows up in family courts. So this is very, very important. And we are encouraging police services to develop training around this and to spend some time here. Again, we have a few examples that we lead everyone to. The victim alleged that she had been assaulted by her partner. Well, she didn't allege it. She reported it. So we really want to make sure that organizations are understanding the impact that some of the language that can have. We are signaling uncertainty about her credibility here. We're saying she alleged. That trauma-informed approach sort of describes what was said, what was observed without inserting that judgment. So if you notice the difference there, right? One version frames the account as questionable. The other simply records the reported behavior. And then just a few more for you here to think about. The victim admitted she had been drinking and was wearing revealing clothing. So admitted reply implies sort of that wrongdoing, like the victim or survivor did something wrong by drinking. And revealing clothing, like whose judgment is that? That's subjective and it doesn't belong in a factual report. So compare that now to the trauma-informed. The victim reported consuming alcohol earlier in the evening. She stated she was wearing a dress or coat. It shifts it, and it means neutral. And, there is a big difference in how that report is read and how the survivor is perceived by those reading it. This one, Me Too campaign, unfounded in Canada. This report was considered unfounded. We don't like that word anymore. It doesn't just influence how an incident is interpreted. It can also determine whether the door to the system stays open or closed. So we encourage officers to really consider, closing the report at this time, no corroborating evidence was located to support laying charges. The survivor was referred to support services and advised they may contact police at any time. So that really leaves the door open. When we label it as unfounded, it sounds administrative, but to the person who came forward, it can feel like a judgment on their credibility. Even if that wasn't the intent, I think that is one of those historical practices in policing that we've been doing, and we're asking police chiefs and police leaders to really take a look at that.
And another kind of example of this in action, and when we think of like procedural justice and how you do things and what you do, it's not even just what you say, but where you say it. So here's a couple examples. So the first and the last photo are actually in our police station. So there we have, we call them like soft interview rooms, where you can then bring individuals into these interview rooms. And it's a much more kind of calming approach instead of sitting in that really cold interview with the 2 plastic chairs across from each other, especially when you're talking about some of these extremely traumatizing events. And then in the middle is actually an alternative location. So what we have is with different partner sites, we have alternative locations where officers can meet up with individuals to take reports and those kinds of things. So just maybe coming to the police station is really not where she wants to go and is preventing her or is coming up as a barrier to reporting. And so through that rapport building and offering alternative locations, maybe that's a much better approach for this particular individual.
And I will add on that, the Barrie Police Service built a new station back in 2020, and part of the thought process through that was in order to get to these interview rooms, no longer do you have to walk all the way through the police station. You're coming off the main lobby, and just simple changes like that, if you can do them, can go a long way. So then the next section of the framework is reduce. We want to take on the do no more harm approach. What we want officers to understand is oftentimes when we just show up at an incident in uniform, we've already done harm. It is our goal to do no more harm. So that means applying this trauma-informed lens to our communications, to the way that we show up. That really is the goal. We have to accept that we are probably causing some harm, some trauma just by being present, and we really need to make efforts to reduce that. And then the last section, what I think is very, very important, when we wrote the sexual violence framework, we did not kind of put in this ongoing evaluation. So we weren't sure exactly how it was working. So we wanted to make sure when we built the Canadian framework that there was this review piece that was always in there. We want to make sure that, police chiefs, police leaders continuously go back to those policies, continuously go back and measure them to make sure that they're working and not causing any more harm. So that really is, it's not about blaming individuals when things go wrong. It's about being willing to ask those hard questions about whether the policies and practices and the assumptions are still serving the people that they were designed to protect, and being willing to change that based on the research and evidence that comes back to us.
So this quote feels dramatic when I say it, but I think it's important to understand, right? Like the impact of some of the things that we do that we can have. So this says, society pays dearly for the experiments it could have conducted but didn't. Hundreds and thousands of people have died, millions of crimes have been committed, and billions of dollars have been wasted because people have bowled ahead on their assumptions and created interventions without testing them before they were put in place. Like I said, it feels a little dramatic, but I want to think back to, when we think of like traditional evaluations of success in policing. Constantly in this role, I'm asking, well, why are we doing it that way? And so often you'll hear, well, that's because that's how we've always done it. You need to start rethinking our practices. Working. What does working look like? How are we measuring success? Is this worth the investment, or do we need to look elsewhere, do something different? Is there better ways we could have prevented harm from happening? And this is really where like the evidence-based policing lens comes in, but it's kind of, what we think about is if you know better, you should be doing better. And there's a lot of research and information out there on how to do better. So that should be part of your consciousness as police leaders. That's extremely important. And for my researchers on the call, advocate, bug, put this in front of people. So, there's no excuse to say we're not going to do it this way, because there's research and evidence to support doing it a different way, which I get when it comes to challenging a police culture that has been put in place and that really values tradition and even, right, when we look at not wanting to fail, right? Policing doesn't want to fail. It's very hard for a police agency to say, hey, we tried something and it didn't work. But there needs to be an acceptance of vulnerability when it comes to testing things and making sure what we're doing and what we do is working or is not working, and being accepting to the fact that something is not working. One of the best examples of this I look at is the Scared Straight, kind of any kind of fear-based approach to youth. When we look at traditional police programs, at least especially here in Canada, they've traditionally been very fear-based, right? Don't do this. This is what your face will look like on drugs. Here's a person who went through it that's going to scream and scare bad behavior out of you. Knowing the brain science of that, it's absurd to think that, because you're just putting people in amygdala hijacks. And this is the opposite of a trauma-informed approach. But they did studies on this and found that doing nothing would have been better than this, right? For those who they did comparisons, and this is a meta-analysis, so it looked at multiple studies to see, what worked and what didn't, and that's the finding was doing nothing would have been actually much better. People who received this kind of fear-based programming were 60 to 70% more likely to offend than compared to those who just didn't get this, right? That is us intervening and causing harm, and that is why it is so important for us as police agencies to review what we're doing, because yes, to a certain point, right, the involvement of police may cause harm, but do no more harm, and we better not be doing practices that cause more harm. And how do we know that? By measuring and testing things, and that's so, so important, continuously reviewing our practices.
So you'll notice that it is continuous and cyclical, and the idea there was we recognize that not everyone's starting in the same place. There's nothing wrong with going backwards. If you've rethunked something and then you're trying to respond that way and you're realizing you're actually causing more harm, we do expect you to go back and start over. And that's why you see that the 6R model built in this fashion. And yeah, as Madison said, you really need to bring in your researchers. You really need to, measure every initiative that you try, because the scared straight one is such a good example of where we failed, really.
Mhm.
So I'm going to hand it to Madison now. She's going to take you through some things that the Barrie Police specifically did when they're looking at things through this trauma-informed lens.
Mhm.
And then we'll open it up to some questions after that.
Yeah. So when we talk about procedural justice, right, kind of being the anchor of this framework, we did a research project here with Dr. Holly Campo. I will say about 2022 to 2023. And she did research, and at the time, trying to pitch this to police everybody was like, what are we doing? Doing interviews with individuals who were in our cells, so arrested individuals, to ask them about their experience with policing. And this was a tough project to sell. And there's a lot of different reactions, some were like, well, why do we need to hear their voice, right? Like that was kind of a common thing we'd hear, or, well, they're all gonna crap on us because they're in our cells. Of course they hate us, or, what have you. There was a range of emotions that came with this project, but it really showed the importance of process versus outcome. So in this project, of the individuals she interviewed in our cells, 67% were satisfied or very satisfied with their arrest. You think, whoa, how can someone be satisfied with their arrest? And when we dug into the data, it talked about the importance of these little acts. She calls them like little acts of humanity. I call them little acts of procedural justice, because I think operationally that's really what they were, right? Giving somebody voice choice, hearing them, being neutral, etc. But it's these little acts of procedural justice that were so important in an individual feeling satisfied with arrest. And when you ask, okay, well, who cares if they're satisfied with their arrest? We could go into the whole police legitimacy and the importance of that. But nonetheless, an example that really sticks in my head, and this is why I have our lovely puppers up here on the screen. There was an individual that was arrested via canine. So the dog went after them and actually bit them right in the buttocks. And, this is kind of how they found their way to our cells. And that person said they were very satisfied with their arrest. But when you go back and look at it, they're saying things like, oh, well, when I went down, it kind of hurt my shoulder. So the officer was able to cuff me in the front and kind of made sure that it was comfortable for me. Or another one, was like, oh, well, he let me have a smoke before I had to go into custody. Or these kinds of things of like little acts of procedural justice were so important. Now, on the flip side of this research, we also heard about what impacts relationships and what makes people dissatisfied with their arrest. And this research project led into another project, as many do. So what we heard from this one is, the people who were not satisfied with their arrest or their experience with police was, well, I asked for help and got policing. Which really, I'm sure any police officer in the room, that kind of like stings, right? So you're thinking, well, I would think that I'm there to help you if you're calling. A lot of these people in our cells at the time called police themselves. Some of them called police themselves, reporting that they were having, kind of a mental health crisis or addiction issues, etc. And ultimately ended up in our cells. And, we did see sometimes the outcome in ourselves, people could still be satisfied. But when you don't do it in a procedurally just way, or you don't have people feeling as though they were heard, they are extremely dissatisfied. And we heard that, asked for help, and got policing. So we started to think about this and really rethink how we respond. And we looked to our data. So 70%, and this is actually dated, it might be a little bit smaller or bigger now, but a large percent of our calls for service at this time, which this data I believe was from 2023, 70% of our calls for service are considered non-emergency. Now that can be a range of things. 90% of our calls for service are non-criminal, which is also surprising for some potentially. You think of like missing persons and stuff isn't criminal, but still policey. But ultimately, we have this intersection of calls that are non-emergency and non-criminal. And what does that look like? Well, the biggest users of our police services is often, as we talk about in the law enforcement public health space, are also high users of the emergency department, high users of paramedics, high users of this, that, and this, right? So we see a high frequency of individuals that face intersections of mental health, addiction, housing insecurity. We looked at our data and we saw that 500 individuals, or just over 500 individuals, had 6+ contacts with the police within a year that did not involve charges. Why are we being involved? What are we doing? Obviously, enforcement is not addressing the root cause or dealing with the situation. So we really rethought our response here. What are these people dealing with? Like we said, mental health, addiction, housing. In these calls for service, we scanned very, very low risk of safety concerns. So why are police going? So what we did is we set up a care program. So what happens is, although we do have alternative phone numbers like 211 or 988 that are meant to be, diverted away from police, a lot of these calls will still come into police. Why? Because people feel uncomfortable. Hey, there's a guy outside my business. He's acting kind of weird. He's really dirty. Can you come move him along? That still goes to police because there's kind of this underlying safety uncomfortableness risk that gets involved. Or individuals are the danger to themselves, right? Hey, this guy's walking in traffic, that kind of thing. So they come to police and our communicators can then triage, if there's no safety concerns, if there's no weapons, etc. They call and dispatch directly a paramedic, a community paramedicine paramedic, so kind of like more specially trained and does clinics and stuff in the community, and a mental health worker with our Canadian Mental Health Association. So they respond instead of police. Now, we're always there as backup, absolutely, but ultimately, they need us very little. And that's really important because when they ask for help, ideally, they're getting help, not policing, if that's kind of the consequence that we're dealing with. So this is an example of really rethinking our responses, because this was also a very tough sell. What do you mean they call police and you don't get a police officer? Do we need one? Is there really a safety concern, right? So making sure as long as you have those checks and balances in place, you're still serving the community just in a better way, right? Another example of a project that we're running is looking at alternative responses for incidents of mental or intimate partner violence, but specifically what we call is like verbal only. So there's no charge. Now, 67% of our IPV calls are verbal only. So whether it just be a verbal altercation, no evidence of, physical injury, etc. So again, we started asking, okay, well, knowing course of control, knowing trauma informed, knowing that individuals may deal with us in a verbal only incident multiple times, how are we supporting them, right? Because a lot of the times arrest can be access to services, right? Both for offenders and victims. But what happens when they deal with us through all of these touch points that weren't arrest or criminal? So we have a kind of secondary responder program. And again, we're measuring it, we're piloting it, where we have, officers will show up on scene, but then they'll refer out to this team. And it's a victim liaison officer. So Kira in the pink, she is a sworn police officer, but goes in plain clothes. And June, who is a frontline worker with our women and children shelter. So again, specialized services, they may not need to go into shelter, but June is a wealth of knowledge of support and help. And it's an alternative response that, you leave that call for service, things are a little bit heightened. And if you get a call from June the next day saying, hey, I know this happened, how can we support you? Like, again, a different response. It's not just policing. So I'll play this video. It might be a little quiet, so I would turn up your volume. And it's just a quick video of them kind of talking about their program and what they do.
I'm Detective Constable Kira Brooks with Barrie Police's Crimes Against Persons Unit. I'm our victim liaison officer and have been doing this work for just over a year. I love that we are based on a trauma-informed approach to supporting victims and survivors, and I'm super excited to be working with June on an incredible project that she's about to tell you about.
Thanks, Kira. As Kira mentioned, I work at the Women and Children Shelter, and I've been blessed with working with Kira on a new project called Early Response. So my role is as an early response worker to work with Kira to attend to domestic violence calls for support, for resources, referrals, and safety planning. The thought is behind the project that we are hoping to be able to reduce the amount of times that there is a repeat in calls for police service with domestic violence incidents, and hoping that that intervention makes it that the incident doesn't go to a more violent incident. I bring with myself, as Kira mentioned, many years of experience working at the shelter as a trauma-informed worker, and am very pleased to be able to offer this service in partnership with Barrie City Police and work with her, Kira, and the work that she's doing that is amazing already.
So they're a team that gets to engage with the whole family, really. And again, when we think of everybody involved, right, what support services are needed for the aggressor, the victim, the kiddos, right? How can we better support this so it doesn't turn into or escalate to something criminal and get worse for that family? Another example that we're doing too, and again, like, when we think rethink, not just rethink how police are responding, but rethink the partners you're working with and what that response looks like. So we looked into our policing data when it came to youth. So how many times did police deal with a youth, not as an offender, but prior to their first criminal charge? So we did some data digging and we found that 65% of youth who have been criminally charged had 5 contact points with police before their first charge. 18% dealt with police 21 plus times. What does that indicate, right? When we talk about adversity, when we talk about trauma and brain science of youth, and when we talk about victim offender overlap and eventually becoming justice clients, right? There is a lot of face time police have with some of these kiddos. And those without services or support are wasted opportunities, right? And it's us watching kind of these kids that then become our clients in the future. So we looked at all of our data, you know, when we were like, okay, well, how are they involved? They're often involved just as a complainant or a bystander, right? Like labeled child under 12 or just kind of in the home when these things are happening. And how are they involved or what calls? Often a police assistance family dispute, assault, mental health act, ambulance assist, very like social disorder indicator, right? Especially when we think of the intersection of policing and public health, right? What are these kids seeing? And really, some of them become self-fulfilling prophecies. And we say, when we look at this data, you know, what is predictable is preventable. So how as police can we do better? So we kind of pulled those kids. Again, this data is a little dated. We're doing this program actively right now, but this is kind of a data from the pitch that we did to our leadership. Looking at kids saying, look, we have 20 kids or 30 kids we can help right now by better supporting them, better connecting them. What do we do about it? So what we started to do is a collaboration between our city and 2 social services. So I, as the analyst, look up the data. We have a special constable, which in Canada is a non-sworn officer. I know in the UK and stuff, a special constable is a little different. It's a non-sworn individual, but it's civilian, but they're still in uniform and there's certain capabilities that they have. So we work together. I say, here's the kiddos, here's, you know, the 20 kids that I think fit the pathway right now. She'll reach out either to parent, guardian, caretaker, or if they're over 16, them themselves, get consent. Hey, we noticed that, you know, you've been dealing with us quite a bit. How about some access to programming, etc.? So right now we have direct pathway referrals to free recreational programs. So all of our city rec programs, camps, arts program, music programs, all of these things, free access. And this is thankfully to a grant, but it shows, right, if we're spending money on a program that doesn't work, why don't we move it over here? Then we also partner with, it's called CFS, and it's a counseling service. And we have free, direct, no waitlist counseling for these youth, especially when we look at, for example, children involved in intimate partner violence or young boys involved in intimate partner violence. And we look at the data, and now they're beating kids up at school, right? They're showing their way to express emotion is anger. So how do we interrupt that before it gets worse or becomes criminal, right? And then we also work with our Salvation Army, and they do additional programming. So this is kind of an example. Again, we're using police data that we traditionally haven't used. We're looking at these touch points when we have these kids, and we're saying, okay, what can we do to interrupt the pathway and get them better connected? So this is like another example, kind of rethinking our approach. And then lastly, another one I want to mention is what we look like. So again, not just what we do, but how we do it. So we switched all of our police cars to be highly visible. And this was very challenging in our culture because, as you see, our old police car is dark and cool and scary and mean looking, and officers love it because it's so tied to their identity in the hypermasculine culture of policing, which, we can go on and on about. But we looked at the research and said, okay, how can we very passively increase our approachability and be more responsive to our community? Dr. Ryland Simpson out of Simon Fraser University did a bunch of research on police officer uniforms and, what was deemed as approachable, trustworthy, untrustworthy, scary, predatory, all of those pieces, and found that the more visible you are, the more approachable and trustworthy you are perceived by the public. So, for example, when he did his testing, officers in like the high-vis traffic vests scored very high for approachable and trustworthy. Officers in sunglasses where you can't see their eyes or dark gloves scored as not so great, a lot less approachable, a lot less trustworthy. So we applied that research into practice and into our operations. So we created a very highly visible police car, as well as giving officers the option to wear these high-vis shirts, right? So again, being very visible. And a lot of this, like I said, comes from research, not just on Ryland's work of how officers look, but when we look at the car out of the UK, of course, this is international. A lot of people in the UK are like, yeah, duh, this is what we look like. There's a lot of research on visibility when it comes to the Battenberg patterns. So we applied that. There's a lot of research on retroreflective material out of transport truck research. So we applied that. There's even research on lime green fire trucks being involved in 50% less accidents. So again, okay, let's get that specific green up there for officer safety even, right? So think of the things you really want to see, a tennis ball coming at your face or an AED when somebody's having a heart attack or a stroke. Those are those colors very intentionally, right? So we kind of looked at that research, thought about what do we want to look like as a police service and applied that. So that's just another example of kind of even very passively, because a lot of people, when they interact with the police, it's just seeing them drive by, When was the last time you think your average citizen spoke with a police officer or was involved in a police call? Not very often, right? But simply just seeing them driving down the street has an impact on your perception. So how can we be seen as more approachable and trustworthy for those who are even just seeing us come by?
So thanks, Madison. Hopefully that kind of piques some interest for all of you. I'm constantly coming to Madison's office. You can see how engaged she is in this work and how it can really enhance the work that we're doing. So as part of the framework, we really wanted to provide some sort of tangible takeaways. So one thing that is available in the framework is a scorecard. So that really is, if you scan, each QR code here goes to these specific ones I'm speaking of. If you scan the scorecard one, you can go in and you can just start with a baseline measure for your organization. Where do we currently sit? Madison actually built this scorecard. This is what we have done to the Barrie Police. We continue to work forward to try and improve our scoring and improve our trauma-informed responses. That also was a lesson learned from the sexual violence. So now we know where everyone is starting. You can start from there and build on it. We also mentioned that quick reference interview guide. Again, we have that up in our station in some of our interview rooms. It's great to print off a few little cards as well, so those frontline officers can have that with them. If they're struggling to find sort of the way to ask a question at any of these incidents, they can just quickly look at that and refer to it. And then you can also print off this infographic if you want that around your service, if they can start recognizing and understanding the 6 R's. It and the procedural justice. It just helps to embed that within your organization. Yeah, so we do have this online version. If you have had the chance now to scan that QR code, again, that was just another lesson learned from the sexual violence framework. We can go in and change this at any time. As we know, things change quickly. We learn something from research and maybe we want to add it to this document. So the one that you go to online will always be up to date. So any changes that are made, we can make on the fly. So if you print it, it's as good as up to the day that you printed it. We haven't made too many changes, but we do intend to enhance that and bring to it more examples of some of the things that Madison was just speaking about today, and maybe some hints on how to pull that data and what that can look like within your own organization. And I just did want to highlight, since those other 2 frameworks that I mentioned at the beginning, so we launched the Canadian Framework for Trauma-Informed Response in Policing in 2024. Recently, the National Framework for Police Intervention and Intimate Partner Coercive Control has been launched, and that was through the CACP Community Safety Committee and the work being done by Dr. Carmen Gill here in Canada. So all of these are sort of our passion. It's a trilogy of trauma-informed responses, if you will. So I encourage you to take a look at all of them. If you cannot find access to any of them, let me know. I can send that to you. But yeah, we'll open it up to any questions now.
Yeah.
And yeah, thank you.
Wow. Thanks, Val. Thanks, Maddie. What a journey. You've done really, really well to get through all of that. It's
Thanks for
brilliant.
hanging on.
So, no, you've been great. So we're asking everybody that's on the call, and I can see that people are from all over the world on the call, to start putting some questions in the chat bar. There's a couple already that I'll come back to in a second, but we've already had people come in advance of the webinar, dropping some questions in. So I'll start off with one of those if we can. And you kind of touched on it right at the beginning, Val, Maddie. You talked about how trauma-informed policing can be sometimes seen as soft policing. And we see all over the world a lot of politicians or police leaders talking about the importance of enforcement and the importance of and making that a sort of political gambit. How do we make sure that the balance of enforcement and trauma-informed policing is out there? How do we get that message out there?
Yeah, so I think it's important to understand we're not taking away enforcement at all. That's not what we're saying. Enforcement still exists. It's that human approach. It's that people approach that I think you can apply to anyone. And I think when Madison speaks to the victim offender overlap, I think that's where we're kind of seeing some of that disconnect in that offenders are offenders and they need to be held accountable. Like we said, we're not taking away accountability. We're just understanding where they're coming from. And we are encouraging sort of that proactive approach earlier on so that we can see the benefits later. But we're not saying don't charge anyone. That is not the incident at all. We are saying, though, we have this assumption that if we charge someone, the behavior will stop. And I don't think there's any research, Madison, correct me if I'm wrong, that would suggest yet.
You can't really arrest yourself out of problems, and that's been shown in a lot of different pieces. Arrest works for some and doesn't for others. And I think the key here is accountability. But accountability can look very different. And how you hold people accountable and the pathways to get there are really important.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Thank you. I'm going to bring Zoe Kelsall in, is a DCI Detective Chief Inspector in England and in the UK. And she's talked here about Opsateria and the crossovers between some of the work you're doing and Opsateria. Zoe, do you want to add to that, add to your question?
No, that was a bit of a surprise. Put me on the spot there, but really good input this afternoon. So really good to kind of hear the difference that and how far-reaching trauma-informed. I've put it in the chat, kind of my role in the UK in Opsateria. So some of those key focuses are procedural justice, trauma-informed, and lots of other pillars which have transformed really the way UK policing deal with rape and serious sexual offending. Just to add to that question, in terms of outcomes for victims, accepting that they look very differently, Has your change in approach, have you kind of reaped the rewards and seen any positive outcomes data-wise in Calais?
I do want to talk about a project that we don't have right now, but London Police does. And I know in the UK it started from Stacey Rothwell, the virtual call response program for victims of intimate partner violence. We piloted it, or like London Police, who's a great partner of ours, London, Ontario Police, piloted it here, and they showed that through that work, victims felt much more satisfied, and they actually had better prosecutorial outcomes because they were collecting better evidence by taking the time with victims through that kind of approach. So that's a trauma-informed response approach, to do like a virtual call response when victims are ready, you know, they can do it from home, etc. And they felt better supported throughout the process. And we even heard a lot of agencies and Crown saying like, oh, if we knew this was available, like we would be putting and referring victims, we think we'd see a lot more reporting. So that's an example through their project and their pilot where they found much better outcomes for victims through a different response, a different police response.
Excellent, thank you. I won't take up any more of other people's questions, but thank you, Justin.
No problem, Zoe. I might put another few people on the spot. Yeah, we'll see how we get on. So, Val, you talked about 20% of offenders have also been victims. Do you think the police officers see them in that way as well?
Absolutely not. And I think when I speak to the Rethink thing, the Rethink part that is difficult for police organizations, I think, to look at, part of that is, you know, that disconnect in officers really recognizing sort of the past of some of our offenders. And I think that is a big piece that we really need to concentrate on to help them understand that. But yeah, and a way to do that, and that's why I always have Madison here by my side, is with that data. Because they can feel a certain way, and our chief will always say this, you can feel a certain way, but if the data says something else, you have to pay attention. And so I encourage those police services out there that might be kind of facing some of the same pushback, is to always bring that along with you, because they can speak to, I mean, Madison can, you know, she can get access to things that we can't as police officers. But I think you're right, that is a big piece, and that is a hurdle that we are constantly sort of facing.
Yeah, and that's like that mindset shift, right? Like traditionally there's victims and there's offenders, and offenders are, you know, especially, and you can't blame the frontline officer, they have a very tunnel vision of reality, what they're responding to on the road, and they're seeing these things. So I think that's where like that education and kind of that like stepping back, that rethinking, that providing the information and data can maybe make them go, oh, oh, wow. And I think some of our older officers, like I was saying, they're now seeing kids of people they arrested early in their career are kind of going, oh, whoa. And so just kind of providing people the opportunity to be educated and just hear a different perspective is so important. And that's got to be short and sweet, right? Whether it be like on our TV screens, like, did you know 20% of our highest harm offenders have been victims, or just kind of short, quick, sweet hits of this information to reframe a little bit.
And I do think we have to give our officers a voice as well. That's part of that procedural justice. And I do think some of the things that we try to sort of, the initiatives that we try to push out, sometimes they feel like we're not hearing them. And so trying to get them involved in these initiatives, trying to sit down and communicate the why, I think is really, really important when you start taking on this work. And we haven't always done that well.
Yeah,
Yeah, we are definitely working on it, but I think that's a really important piece.
And I think that listening to both of you, this is a challenge not just for yourselves in Barry, but also globally. You know, we talk a lot when we're delivering trauma-informed policing. We talk to police officers of all different ranks, all different levels, and some of them start off as what we call serial arm folders. So they start off with arms folders like this. And it's only when you start talking about the intergenerational effect and neuroscience and the amygdala and all, and that you can start to see people coming in going, actually, I wish I'd known this 30 years ago. And I certainly had that moment when I was in policing.
The opportunity to learn about that, because how can you expect them to know that when you haven't educated them on that as well? So you need to make sure you're integrating that information in your in-service training, in your recruit training. Like you need to also, you can't expect them to know something that you haven't given them the opportunity to learn either.
And peer evaluation is a really important piece, because it allows you, even if you pull, you know, 1 or 2 interviews a month, or when you have time to sit down with the officers and go through that, and just sort of say, gently point out the language that maybe they could have, and give them suggestions on how they maybe could have asked that question differently. Because like I said, everyone has the best of intentions, good intentions. Police officers want to do a great job. And having been in this job for 29 years, I was that officer that, you know, you committed a sexual assault, you're a bad person, you know, IPV, we need to charge everyone. But it took, you know, hearing about the brain science, and it took watching my own interviews. I went through when it was the Me Too campaign, I was assigned to a systemic review of the Barrie Police Service. So I looked at every single intimate partner violence interview that had been done over the course of 2 years. And when you apply that lens, it's really loud. It's really obvious. And so I encourage officers and supervisors to go back and look at those interviews and look at it from this lens, and then create your training from that.
Thanks, Val. Thanks, Maddie. I'm going to bring Glenn Blackwell in, who's asked a question in the chat. Glenn, would you like to ask your question in person? Glenn, are you there?
Yep, sorry, just trying to get everything sorted. Can you hear me?
Yeah, we've got
Yes.
you. Got you loud and clear.
Yep. No worries. Oh, it's going. So yeah, I was just thinking, in line with your positive behaviour interviews, like with your offenders in the cells there, has it expanded on that, or look more into if the trauma-informed approach to the offender during the arrest process happens, is that having any impact on an early or increased guilty plea outcome? Obviously, you know, sometimes I'm a police officer with 35 years of WA police, and I know back in the past you'd, as you were saying, well, treat them rough and get them in the cell, and then usually end up with a not guilty plea, because maybe it's not so much because they were caught red-handed, but they just want to run you through the hoops. Is there that sort of thing?
That's a great idea and project to do. We haven't looked at it here, but another example I can use, and I don't know what it has looked like in terms of guilty pleas, but I know in terms of men reaching out. So there's 2 programs. So Waterloo Police here in Canada, they have a early intervention program where they refer, again, instead of just referring victims to help, they offer men's counseling directly. And you know, it's male counselors, they call themselves like accountability workers, and that's really what they work on. I'd be curious to see those who volunteer programs, which I think their pilot has been running not very long. They've had over 100 men voluntarily go through this. If the men that choose like correctional fixing behavior, working on themselves, if they're noticing a difference in their outcomes in terms of guilty pleas. So right now in Barrie, we have traditional process where it's still kind of like, well, you're arrested and there's not very many services for men who cause harm in our community, and that's something we're working on. But it'd be interesting to see those that voluntarily engage with those services. Are we seeing a little bit more of a okay, maybe I need to start changing my behavior? And you're right, kind of switching the pleas and the way they're going through the justice system.
We're always open to global research, just saying.
Yes. Partnerships are great.
Love it.
Val, Maddie, this one's come from the Trauma-Informed Special Interest Group, and it was talking about the difference between culture and legislation. And the question is the issue around trauma-informed practice cultural, or do we need primary legislation to deal with it?
How does our chief say? It's not this or that, it's this and that.
And how you implement those policies, but also what's wrong with those policies.
Right.
Yes.
Right. So that is a big question. Yes, it's a little bit of both. You know, if policy is made and everyone has to just follow it, they're not really, and there's no buy-in, then how effective is it actually? But if culture is changed and then we create the policy, there tends to be more compliance based on belief. So yeah, it's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Yeah. And it's like where rubber meets the road, right? Or where policy becomes practice. So I think of mandatory charge, right? Like back 30 years ago when that came into place, I think there was an understanding from advocates that was, we maybe not say trauma informed at that time, but in the best interest. But you know, how police are implementing that, and then we're seeing dual charging, and let's say somebody's like, no, I don't want to charge, and they're like, too bad, we're doing it. It's also the how, right? So it's such a balance.
Yeah, a lot of work to do still. I think we're we're way ahead of where we were, and it's inspiring to see. It's inspired, like 5 years ago, we wouldn't have done a conference on trauma-informed policing. That just wouldn't have happened, right? So I think we're moving in the right direction, but yeah, we need everybody. We need everybody. Yeah.
Thanks. Maddie, this one's for you, and again, it's come from the special interest group. Critics of trauma-informed policing say the evidence base for it is limited.
Mhm.
What do you think?
I say that's because we often as police don't measure the impact of what we're doing. And that is the importance of doing that, because what we find doesn't work is just as valuable as what we find does work. And so, for example, we're testing this early response program, we're doing a randomized control trial, we're evaluating that. I can guarantee you so many other police services have tried things like this, but we have no clue if it worked or didn't because they didn't measure it. So in terms of evidence base, I think a lot of police operational work has a small evidence base because either it's internal and they don't release it because there's so much gatekeeping there, or we just don't measure what we do, so we don't actually know if it worked. And so I think there's so much importance in terms of doing something, testing to see if it works, and then going from there, but also understanding what does works mean and works for who. So you also have to be really robust in that approach, right? So when we look at things like this response, well, just because maybe we end up with more people calling the police in terms of intimate partner violence, it's not saying things are less safe or it didn't work. Did we increase trust so people feel more comfortable reporting? So also understanding the nuances, right? When you're measuring these approaches and having that like operational and institutional knowledge of the police data is really key.
Yeah, absolutely. And one of the difficulties with trauma-informed policing is always going to be it's around prevention, and therefore, how do we know what we prevented if we prevented it? Which is always a challenge for us in the world of evidence-based policing, isn't it?
Yeah, we can't measure the victimization that didn't happen because of what we did. The best you can do is try and have control groups and pre and posts and put a little bit of comparison as much as possible. But sometimes in an operational environment, right, that's not possible. We don't work in a lab where research can be very controlled and rigorous and very validated. So you also have to work with what you have.
Thank you. Thanks, Maddie. So I'm going to put out a final call for any more questions before we got the last 4 minutes before I sum up. Is there any more? Zoe, you've put good point. What does good look like? Performance needs to understand this beyond arbitrary data. How does that fit in with the data card that you've done? Well, Maddie, you know the performance product that you've got at the end of the
Scorecard.
Oh, yeah. Well,
Scorecard.
even with the scorecard. So that's really interesting. Something when it comes to the scorecard, when it comes to evaluating your organization, who's filling out that scorecard? Because Inspector Gates knows a lot of the programs that are happening and may have more favorable leanings towards what we're doing because she's aware than your average frontline officer that's maybe been on the road for a year. So even when it comes to the scorecard, right, get a robust kind of sample of your organization to fill that out and take averages from that. Because what one person sees as, oh, we're doing really good in this, and then another person is like, oh, we're doing crap in that. I never had a chance for training in that. Like, even in the scorecard, make sure you're giving different voices and choices and opportunities because you're going to hear different responses and different data from different populations in your police service. So that's also really important.
Thank you. Thanks, Zoe. Does that answer your point there?
Yeah, I mean, it just kind of correlates, doesn't it, with what does good look like? What are the outcomes that we want to see when we're delivering a thoughtful service, whether that's to the victim or suspect. And quite often we have KPIs that are arbitrary data and it's outcome based. Yeah. And then we wonder when we go back to people and kind of ask questions about their experience, whereas they've got the arbitrary outcome, but their experience is really poor and really shocking, and we've lost that trust and confidence. So I think that's really fundamental for organisations wherever you're located is actually what does good look like and measure that so you can capture those successes. But well done.
Yeah, and measuring not only outcomes but processes and experiences throughout, right? Like you were saying, kind of that mix between qualitative, quantitative, and not being just so outcome and stat focused, but also understanding the nuances of experience throughout that helps explain the why to some of those stats potentially, right? Like if people aren't engaging in this program, but then they find out when the officers are offering it, it's a bad time or it's coming off as hasty. It's not the program that isn't keeping people engaged. It's the delivery of the offer of the program is preventing people from wanting to go take it, right? So like understanding like it's such a journey and it's so robust and truly understanding, and data can help, but knowing the nuances of that is important as well.
Thanks, Maddie. Thanks, Val. So, we're coming towards the end. I just got want a few thank yous. The first one's to Vi and Maya for making this happen and doing all the technical stuff behind the scenes, because it's not easy putting a webinar on and making all the tech work. So, a big thank you to both of you for doing that. An extra big thank you to Val and Maddie. If I could, we'll give you a virtual round of applause. Because we're going to be seeing you at LEPH in Leeds, aren't we? You've got a number of presentations to do there, so that's great. And no doubt there'll be people on the call here who'll be thinking about whether they can get over across to Leeds in the UK for the Law Enforcement Public Health Conference at the end of September. But on behalf of GLEFA, on behalf of the Trauma Informed Policing Special Interest Group for GLEFA, thank you. That was excellent. And the questions and answers in the audience engagement was brilliant as well. So thank you. Thank you very much, everybody. And have a great day.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Take care.